My name's Dr Jeremy Anbleyth-Evans. I'm originally from Kernow in the UK, in the southwest of the island, and I'm a specialist in fisheries, human geographies, I suppose, and I look at fisheries and planning and energy and conservation at the coastal nexus, attempting to use different ways to enable different approaches, epistemologies, and methods towards emancipatory strategies and different forms of development. So today I'd like to look at fisheries in particularly in Scotland and how that relates to blue democracy in different case studies, blue democracy framework as a method to enable coastal communities and territorial use rights as a way for fishing communities to be empowered in defining their spatial territories, their seasonal rules, and strategies for different forms of gear use, such as towed gear and static gear. I'm going to briefly touch on the origins of fisheries and participation today, historically and beyond, as well as examples of successful marine management systems and fisheries methods, and how that links more widely to ports, aquaculture, and other forms of development. So I want to look at how these challenges and how we can make them work. So very interested and open to different ideas and case studies where this has been successful and build collaborations with you all. So next slide, please. So introducing territorial use rights and blue democracy. Blue democracy as a framework is about going beyond the centralized unitary states form of governance where coastal communities are empowered through direct democracy or liquid democracy to directly be involved in decisions and planning in ways which both enable them and the environments they have kinship with. So this means active citizens, such as citizens involved in citizen science, other communities, whether it's tourism or fisheries or aquaculture, where relational values, where people have a sort of connection to place and space and interact on a continuous basis and are connected to the environment. So that includes fishing communities, particularly small scale or artisanal fishing communities, indigenous communities, and it's less pronounced with industrial fisheries, which I'm going to come back to. So territorial use rights, as you can see in the diagram in the bottom left, sees opened and closed areas at different seasons and different gear uses according to different geomorphologies and habitat types on the seabed benthos. So next slide, please. Important to this marine democracy framework is understanding fisher local ecological knowledge. So what is that? It's the ongoing interaction through fishing, learning, understanding through hunting and gathering from the sea and the coast, equally true for activities on land, whether farmers or hunters, where different seasons and elements of astronomical observation interact to build a more tacit form of understanding the world. And this has been continuing on for possibly up to 1 million years ago in Africa, where people have got evidence for fishing for crabs and shellfish in the Southern African areas. Some people argue that local ecological knowledge has begun to become general harvesting knowledge because of those interactions with different technologies and scientific participation. But with the diversity of cultures that we know and understand around the world, for example, we've got a picture of the Baju floating fishing community in the bottom left corner, or the people fishing on poles on the top right. There's multiple different ways of understanding and knowing different epistemologies of fishing, which continue today. And so the diversity is arguably increasing rather than becoming global. So next slide, please. So a quick overview in terms of some of the methods for blue democracy that I often use. And I'd like to build on and expand on integrating new methods, starting off with semi-structured interviews with key informants and community leaders, building on to a community meeting, and then developing a workshop where with participatory mapping, linking GIS with the drawing of habitat types and species movements and other threats such as environmental blue injustices or other types of future scenarios such as where energy should be developed in common, how spatial rules can be proposed, and then feedback with the participatory GIS maps for a further round of discussion. So next slide, please. So here's a quick picture of me doing some participatory mapping in Chile where I had more hair. They're looking at the different aquacultural challenges in Los Lagos region with a coastal community with some Mapuche Wiichi activists looking at developing a benthic management area and indigenous marine area. Next slide, please. And here's an example of one of the most successful workshops we had in the Comal Fjord, 120-kilometer fjord, where we looked at the shared values, but also looked at developing new valuations of cold water corals where salmon concessions or salmon farms were put on top of the same areas and pollution was being felt in common where there's privatization of profit. And the Mapuche Wiichi's newly recognized indigenous marine area, which was ultimately led by small-scale fishers, looked to change the paradigm and move the salmon farms out of that area. Next slide, please. So one of the historical bases for the challenges today we face with fishery is that people like Thomas Huxley presented the seas as infinite, as inexhaustible back in the 1880s. Next slide, please. And so there was a massive push with steam trawlers and other forms of fishing, which led to major overexploitation. So what fishers can do now takes 36 times the same amount of effort for place, 100 times for haddock, or 500 times the amount for halibut. Those are the fish at the bottom there from left to right. So that's collapsed the system. So we need to look at how the paradigm can shift. Next slide, please. And historically, that saw the colonization of different spaces. For example, from the 15th century onwards, Britain had hegemony over Iceland, and we had the Cod Wars, which saw the domination of within the 12 nautical mile area of the fisheries in Iceland. And so the Royal Navy had a various different battles to try and maintain those trawling areas within Iceland, but the Icelandics eventually got their marine territory back. So I'm interested in how these coastal communities can be empowered in this type of way. Next slide, please. So there's a big difference between small-scale fisheries and industrial fisheries in terms of the community relationships, how they relate to markets, the different types of fishing trips they carry out, which are typically within the 6 nautical mile area, and the local consumption as well, which is shared within kinship networks, friends and family. And increasingly, that's becoming more internationalized, but there is a continuous accessibility, whether it's with working class communities who can go out on the boat and learn about fish and where they come from in the local area, going down the harbour and having a chat with different people. And it typically uses potting or creeling, rod and lining, set netting, as well as trawling and dredging in the UK, predominantly for shellfish species at the moment, lobster and crabs, and also quota species such as pelagic, mackerel, herring and splat, and as well as cod, haddock, plaice and Dover sole. But this is often wrapped up in contested private property rights for quota, which is 98% of which is held by industrial fisheries in the UK. Next slide, please. So there's immense value for fisheries across the UK, and this national benefit can be expressed in terms of cultural heritage, social fabric, food security, so that historically fishers would ensure that people would get access to food, and also the local coastal economy today, ensuring jobs, whether in processing or fishing or even tourism, through the creation of sense of place. So you can see on the right, we did some work looking at how populations are shifting. So that's Sarah Coulthard's work on how the populations of fishes are changing across the UK and predominantly declining significantly. Around 10,000 people working on fishing boats today. Next slide, please. And part of the challenge of industrial fisheries is that they can go dark, as expressed in this particular slide, in the Galapagos in Ecuador. So the Chinese industrial fleet, the long distance fleet, could go in dark and take a lot of the fish, where in the Galapagos there is a high biodiversity but lack of coastal capacity to be able to enforce those spatial areas. So they can go in and out and migrate or be nomadic in those places and spaces. Next slide, please. So this is an extreme example, the Chinese long distance water fleet, and certainly quite different to many others, but with 2,500 vessels, they can access lots of different areas, and they recently had some battles with the Argentinian Navy. But ultimately, an interesting approach to try and territorialize marine spaces, as you can see on the left-hand side with the Paracel Islands down towards Vietnam, or Spratly Islands towards Malaysia and the Philippines. Next slide, please. So we've seen peak landings of fisheries, peak volumes were in 1988, and that coincided with the peak value of fisheries, and that was propelled by new types of technologies, whether they're cheap fossil fuels back in the 1950s to the evolution of freezers and sonar. We've moved on from the Decker charts you can see on the bottom left corner, which was common up until the 1970s, paper charts to understand where things should be fished again and again, returning to fishing grounds. And then at the same time, super trawlers have got bigger and bigger. The world's largest, the Lafayette, which is about over 200 meters, was arrested, known as the Damazayo, when it was arrested in Peru. They changed their name, the flag of convenience, to the Panamanian flag. It's now known as the Vladivostok 2000, and you can guess which country it belongs to now. Next slide, please. So towed gear has different influences and impacts. In Chile, there's a 5 nautical mile limit for trawling and industrial fisheries for those over 18 meters. Greece has recently been the first European country, I think it's the first country in the world, to ban bottom trawling in all marine protected areas, which is interesting. UK has gear limitations within any area except certain marine protected areas. Japan's quite interesting in that it doesn't have marine protected areas, but has a kind of fisherman-led territorial use rights with seasonal voluntary bans. So there's lots of different flavors and forms around the world. Next slide, please. And so considering this territorial use rights framework, how it relates to co-management is an interesting question for application in the UK. For instance, in Scotland, we don't have co-management, but we do have inshore fisheries groups. So creating place-based management tools is part of the challenge, but ultimately they are led by communities of fishers, fisheries cooperatives and associations to have exclusive rights to access fish in those designated areas to improve sustainability and over-exploitation. In Chile, which is one of the more famous forms, it's particularly focused on benthics, species such as shellfish, and conservation, but they are found around different places: Japan, Mexico, Indonesia. I even heard there's some in Vietnam, which might come back to with some of the co-hosts later on. Next slide, please. And so Norway is often held up to be one of the leaders of these types of sustainable fishing because its early adoption of participatory fisheries science. And that came through in the north of the country through the Lofton Law back in 1897. Some of you won't be able to remember that very clearly, but it did lead to a form of co-management where community-based regulations spontaneously and in a planned way created closed and open areas. There's 15 local closed-in areas in the Lofton Islands featuring handline, longline, gillnets, Danish seine, and it's led by the fishermen themselves, and it's ongoing training to support their fisheries science. Next slide, please. And so the example of the Chilean AMOs can be, or benthic management areas can be contrasted with that. There's about 747 benthic management areas. What's the first thing is different is that it's only for seabed shellfish fishing, whereas in Norway you have all those different types of fishing on the top of the water columns, such as Danish seine and rod and lining. But it is co-managed with different fisheries scientists, which helps the sustainability. And you can see in the bottom left picture, a diver on a hooker line. So he gets his air down a pipe, recording the different fecundities and the changing dynamics ecologically over time and space. Some of the weaknesses include the small size of the rectangles or the benthic management area and the single sector stakeholder management. Next slide, please. So fisheries in Chile in terms of the quota system has some interesting similarities to the UK system, where quota commodification, which happened in the UK since the 1980s, where the public resource was sold off based on track records for industrial fisheries because of the way that they had recording of their fishing activities, whereas the small scale under 10 meter fishers didn't. In Chile, they see the fishing quota dominated by 7 families, such as the Angelinis or through the Ley de Pesca. And this continues to see about 92,000 small-scale fishers on over 12,750 vessels, and probably about 10,000 people working on the over 18-meter industrial fleet. So next slide, please. Another innovation that's evolved over the last few years is the Mapuche indigenous marine area system through the Lefkenchi law policy. And that's seen a series of different zones, territories claimed for by indigenous groups such as the Mapuche Huichis and the Kaiwashka Yagans to have large spatial areas claimed for traditional and artisanal and subsistence fishing rights, which has led to a major slowdown of aquaculture, particularly salmon aquaculture, and the industrial fisheries in those areas. And they've been creating various different conservation strategies for those local areas. They've got a different worldview to the sort of Western market-based perspective. It's more akin to these relational values, which I mentioned previously, where they see the local marine ecosystem, the Lavken, as part of the family or part of the community with the sacred biodiversity or Itrofil Moyen. You see in the top right picture, there's a celebration of the Huitlipantu, which is the longest day of the year, next to the Abilitawantayao, the sacred island, which generates energy to maintain the ecological health. So they protect the area around that particular island as well, which is part of the ideology or the cosmovision. Next slide, please. So to break down that way of viewing the world a little bit more, it can be related to living well or komi yin. And you also get other elements such as itrofel moyen, the sacred biodiversity, and pepul muen, to resolve the problems. So there's various different dimensions which I break down in another article, which we won't go into here. Next slide, please. So the Panama fisheries law is another interesting contrast. Did some research when I was out there, and they don't have a clear definition of what small-scale artisanal fishing is, which is problematic because it allows the industrial over 12-meter vessels this time to come in as close to the coast as they would like to. So this is a picture of participatory mapping I carried out in King Island, or Isla del Rey, just south of the city of Panama. You can see the beige and brown lines represent the tracks of the industrial vessels as they came close into the coast. And the local coastal communities suggested certain areas in red for conservation or territorial use rights to enable sustainable harvesting. But that hasn't been listened to so far because there's too much centralization and not enough capacity building for coastal communities in this area. Next slide, please. Japan has got a very interesting system, and certainly their territorial use rights gives the local cooperatives the opportunity to have exclusivity for that coastal domain, typically out to about 5 nautical miles, sometimes closer to the coast. There's various different types of fishing, but rod and lining, shellfish gathering. They even sometimes create their own seaweed sea farms, which work alongside the fishing boats. And these boundaries often link and are seaward extensions of municipal boundaries. And that has continued on since probably about the 8th century in one shape or form, when these local villages were ruled by the samurai or the daimon. Next slide, please. So one example which is held out as particularly outstanding is the UNESCO recognized Shirotoko Peninsula. And they use this concept of satomi to explain how the fishing and the harvesting and the activities are all part of the marinescape or the marine landscape, as the people as part of an integral part of the ecosystem which has been maintained for centuries. So in the Shirotoko area, they've divided it into 34 zones based on local ecological knowledge and experience, and declared 7 of these zones for protection for spawning grounds and other forms of protection as well. So there's over 1,057 fishing cooperatives organizations in Japan, and we don't really have any in Scotland, maybe about 2. Next slide, please. And so the Scottish context is quite interesting to reflect on after examining some of these different case studies. In 1985, some of you remember the removal of the 3-mile limit, which was controversial today for towed gear, that is dredging and trawling, in the context of ecological health. And this created ongoing, if sporadic, stochastic impacts for the seabed habitats, whether they were merle or horse mussels, flame shower reefs, native oysters, sepulid reefs, and seagrasses, which the Scottish government calls priority marine features. So according to recent statistics from 2025, the Scottish system is failing across all good environmental status areas for seabed benthos across the different regions. So next slide, please. One of the issues is migratory scallop dredging. Here's a picture of the newly built Halicon at 34 meters. And one of the issues I want to bring in is the ability of these types of fishing boats to go where and when and fish where they want to. Next slide, please. So migratory fishing or nomadic fishing can occur in about 95% of Scottish coastal seas within the 6 nautical mile zone, as well as beyond, with the over 12-metre fleet. But there is 167,000 hectares currently closed to dredging. However, one of the issues is the system of electronic monitoring has been delayed many times and is still being implemented. So there's opportunities for people to get around it. So something like 6.3% of other inshore waters is protected for species such as the flame shell reefs in the top right picture. You can see it marked in the circular images. That's where their openings are. And there's dredge limits as well in terms of how many dredges per side you're allowed. 16 total for the areas around the broader Scottish regions, and then the area around the Shetland Isles, they're the only area of Scotland which has got decentralised community-led management. They've stipulated 10 per side. So they've created their own rule system, which has got 26 areas close to scallop dredging. So next slide, please. So one of the areas I've been working in Scotland is the zone around sort of Angus and Aberdeenshire, which includes fishers down in Carnoustie, Johnhaven, and also Arbroath, and other parts of Aberdeen, and all the way up to Fraserburgh. So I was looking at how the regional, in this case study, how the regional inshore fisheries group operates and how it can evolve. So one of the major challenges, such as highlighted by the Arbroath and Montrose Static Gear Association, is that the scallop dredges can come in and cause damage to the rocky reef ecosystems, which is where they find a lot of the crabs and lobsters, as you can see in the picture on the top left, where we did some participatory mapping. And so they were suggesting that they should have territorial use rights for the area zoned in blue. So far, the Scottish government hasn't responded to invitations to create such a system or listen to the Arbroath, predominantly Arbroath-led, as fishers about creating such a system. They've also argued that habitats beyond 12 nautical miles should be protected, such as the rocky reefs highlighted in the green circle. So on the top right, you can see a picture of an Olex monitor, which is quite interesting because it shows how the fishers use sensory devices, triple echo sounders, to work out how the bathymetry is in terms of the depth and the types of rocky substrates that there are. So the darker red are the areas which have got darker, heavier or more durable rock towards the spectrum of granite, not necessarily so, but a more dense rocky form. So next slide, please. Another recent case study I've been working on is the dredging issues in Loch Oush. So some members of the Scottish Crewmen's Federation highlighted the importance of maintaining the loch area free from dredging, free from those types of impacts. Unfortunately, a few dredgers in 2025 went in there and started dredging on the areas where the horse mussel reefs have been protected and rocky reef areas. There's also flame shell reefs there, but I don't think, as far as I know, they were impacted. So they expressed a certain amount of frustration because the community members there have been building effort with the fishing groups not to fish out those areas, to allow the habitat to recapture that historic biodiversity. And certainly different social movements have been working with the community there, as well as the Scottish government. But the fact that they managed to turn their vessel monitoring system off, or they just went in there without any at all, is relevant to the fact that the Scottish government have recently been critiqued for not working in accordance legally with the National Marine Plan as they're obliged to for fisheries licensing decisions, which is an ongoing discussion. Next slide, please. So there's opportunities to expand alternative systems, decentralized inshore fisheries and conservation authorities, possibly. And these can allow for local fishing communities to develop their own bylaws, their own ways of resolving conflict through deliberation, and create social sanctions. They don't necessarily have to have fines. If they get people around a table in the room, it's much more successful to participate in developing shared understanding. And certainly there's examples of success from the inshore fisheries conservation authorities in the south, for example. The Sussex IFCA recently managed to protect the 1 nautical mile zone from trawling, seeing a lot of marine life return in ways which were unexpected. Next slide, please. And so there's lessons to be learned from different areas. And one of the lessons is that in a recent English fisheries workshop of small-scale fishers, they explained that the IFCAs were insufficient in the sense that they needed to expand the territorial management from 6 nautical miles to at least 12 nautical miles to encapsulate all the activity, because most coastal fisheries actually go up to 12 nautical miles and probably even up to 24 nautical miles this day and age, using the types of engines that they have. And certainly that's up for debate. And also the question is, should pelagic species and the territorial quota rights for pelagic species be related to coastal communities as well? That's something I'm arguing for in a paper currently under development and in previous papers. Next slide, please. And what this would look like in the Scottish context is perhaps if we relate to historical Scottish counties. So, for example, you've got the Highlands is one big community authority at the moment, but you need to have historical counties such as Sutherland, Ross and Cromarty, and beyond, Isle of Skye, for the territorial use rights, whether it's for Lewis or for Aberdeenshire, to develop in those different areas. So certainly, just looking at the question that's been raised there, certainly that's interesting going forward. So you can imagine those white lines going across from the different historical county areas, and that relate to the determination and co-assessment through fisheries science with fishers of those species, pelagic species, whether cod or haddock or another. Next slide, please. So this relates to the idea of participatory fisheries science in the community territories, where fishers take part, as they do in Norway, in the determination of weight, otoliths and size. This does go on in certain Scottish fisheries, particularly the over 12 metre industrial fleet. It doesn't really happen so much with the smaller scale fleet. And if it did, it would allow for the empowerment and co-determination of community quota, arguably. So there's greater opportunities for training fishers, observers, and to be able to consolidate their observations into notes. Next slide, please. Another way to develop this is through towed visual assessment, such as they've been doing in Lyme Bay, using towed cameras underwater to demonstrate the different habitat types which might not be apparent, using triple echo sounders or through trawling up different habitats. And this has led to closed areas in Lyme Bay and the return of sea fans, among other species. Next slide, please. And there's been a certain amount of debate about whether highly protected marine areas is the way forward in Scotland. There's a major contestation, arguably, because the Scottish government didn't embark on participatory community-led determination of territorial use rights in creating the argument for highly protected marine areas in Scotland. So a lot of communities, coastal communities, fishing communities, felt left out from the scheme. So again, it was this issue of over-centralization and the question of who are the winners and losers, who's the conservation for. Next slide, please. One case study which is highly respected is the Lamlash Bay no-take zone in the Isle of Arran, which is led by a series of divers who noted the decline of fishing. And certainly they are a great example of community-led conservation. And also, I'd argue, demonstrating relational values, expressing a sort of eudaimonia or well-being from taking part in supporting the marine scape and the health of the area, taking a more long-term approach in a community of care with the local biodiversity. So that's in contrast to the instrumental value where you have carbon offsetting determinations or bioremediation credits. Also intrinsic value, which is about the inherent worth. Ultimately, it's non-substitutable between space and place and different other forms of natural capital. Next slide, please. One of the other challenges for marine democracy is the expansion of ports. Where I grew up, there's an ongoing contestation about dredging and dumping in Whitsand Bay in southeast Cornwall. So when I was working for the government many years ago, I had a really interesting debate with people from my community ringing me up, saying, when are you going to stop the dumping in Whitsand Bay, and all the material, some of which is contaminated from capital dredging from Plymouth dockyards, arriving in the Whitsand Bay area. So I wanted to highlight the lack of inclusion of stakeholders' local ecological knowledge in the monitoring and how it can relate to future participatory marine planning. And the modelling in this case was demonstrating a false result in that the material was landing somewhere else. And in fact, when the dredger and the dumping was going on, it was landing in Whitsand Bay, but dumping on the flood tide, and the model didn't account for that. Next slide, please. So I just should add as well, that led to the changing of the dredging and disposal site, which is now 10 miles offshore Plymouth. So this led to further work much later on in the Cromarty Firth through the Sea the Valley project when I was working for University of Aberdeen, and we're comparing the Cromarty Firth with the Solent, particularly around Portsmouth Harbour, which is a much more urban area, and looking at habitat restoration trajectories and future scenarios through participatory mapping, as well as some of the challenges of the expansion of the free green port, particularly considering forthcoming opportunities to develop floating offshore wind and also new fixed base offshore wind, and also create a tax-free area around there and Inverness. Next slide, please. So here's a quick slide just demonstrating the breadth and depth of different habitat types and other features that the stakeholders identified, from horse mussel reefs quite close to the disposal site for the port, as well as salt marshes and seagrasses, which people were working to restore. Next slide, please. Another ongoing issue is water pollution, particularly in rivers, but also in estuarine basin areas. At the moment, in the Scottish context, there's a lack of decentralised estuarine planning, and in fact, it's all based on one river basin management system. And there's multiple different river basin systems around Scotland, and certainly sewage is an issue, and it's better in Scotland through the non-privatisation of the water systems, but in the south it remains an ongoing issue, and there is still some sewage problems for surfers, for example, up in Aberdeen. So you can check the map for water quality on that link there. Next slide, please. Another challenge forthcoming is floating offshore wind, building on the fixed base types of wind, and certainly they're going to have a different type of impact potentially, because it's floating on the top, but it's anchored, and there's based on the Kincardine site and other opportunities to monitor, the impacts are slightly different. For example, the magnetic charges down cables underneath the site, and temperature increases are different, as well as the difference with smothering and siltation changes in the areas below and around. So the UK's got significant ambition to get up to 50 gigawatts of installed capacity for floating offshore wind by 2030. That could be up to 10,000 kilometers squared around the islands. So certainly that's a major change. And we've seen some recent contestation with the Berwick Banks and ABS in Scotland, and this is continuously debated. Looking more broadly, a review of marine indigenous management around the world saw different types of mining impacts, sewage impacts, oil and gas, nuclear, military base, industrial fisheries, deep sea mining, aquaculture around the world. And in this macro review, I discovered that these marine indigenous areas are much more successful in their sustainability transitions if they were the ones, coastal communities in charge of the developmental trajectories and fisheries management. And it really depended on the pushback between the community, such as the Guineana against the Panamanians, in the flags at the bottom of the slide, in realizing successful strategies. Next slide, please. So just to try and summarize a little bit, the territorial use rights framework, learning, and some of the strengths and weaknesses of some of the different systems we've discussed today. So Scotland is highly centralized in Edinburgh. So you've got regional fisheries groups. It's potentially quite good MPA coverage, but most of them are paper parks. So the lack of decentralized decision-making and local leadership in territorial use rights in the Scottish counties, the current regional fisheries groups are considered to be very much talking shops and have no local bylaw development or teeth on the bone. In England, it's also very centralized, but the inshore fisheries and conservation authorities are more decentralized according to counties, however, only considers the 0 to 6 nautical mile zone, and the other developmental and marine planning is highly centralized and doesn't take into account local community strategies and leadership. In Chile, also very centralized, and certainly has weaknesses with the AMERBs, the benthic management areas, that they only consider the shellfish exploitation, and don't intersect other types of development such as ports and energy. And although the indigenous marine areas are doing reasonably well. Japan, yes, it's generally centralized, you might argue, in Tokyo, but the fisheries cooperatives are quite heavily linked to the municipalities, so they're reasonably decentralized, and they've got territorial use rights up to 5 nautical miles, but they don't have any marine protected areas, which is potentially problematic in some cases, but I don't know all the details of that at the moment. So next slide, please. So what did we cover today? What should we sum up? Essentially, some of the key messages are that territorial use rights can support small-scale fisheries and enhance conservation at the same time. That potentially pelagic quota should be linked to coastal communities, small-scale fishers, give them more access than the 2% that they have, as long as the fisheries participatory science can be integrated into the territorial use rights. And these can be the building blocks for marine democracy, for enhancing marine planning across energy, across ports, and other types of development, industrial aquaculture. So Scotland is in dire need of coastal community empowerment, whether it's on the Isle of Lewis or the Aberdeenshire coast, and certainly given the opportunity for locally led planning and licensing over trajectories of development, we'll see a real flourishing of ecological confederalism. Great, thanks very much. Is there any questions? Next slide, please.